This year we're talking about having 2020 spiritual vision. Spiritual vision is different than looking at the forms and the conditions and the experiences around us. It really is about focusing our depth of field personally a little bit differently. So the conditions of our lives show up in front of us, and they're really compelling and they're really obvious and they look really real. However, they're not permanent. Nothing comes to stay, it always comes to pass. And so, but the spiritual vision is that which is eternal and enduring, that which is whole, and it's always there in the background, but it doesn't push itself into our awareness. So we actually have to do some inner process to focus on that spiritual truth, particularly when the conditions are very compelling and difficult. And so this is Black History Month. February is Black History Month, and I am often humbled by the number of amazing African Americans in our history whose stories I don't know. So I'm not talking about these two gals this morning or even this month, but if you don't know who they are, you might want to look them up and find out a little bit about them. Mae Jemison was an astronaut, and Maggie Walker was the first woman to be the bank president anywhere, and she was the founder of the bank. So that's pretty amazing. What I'm actually going to be talking about today is a little bit different, but first, it's important to know what day this is. It's always important to know what day it is when you're in relationship, yeah? So over breakfast one morning, a woman said to her husband, "I bet you don't know what day this is." "Of course I do," he answered. He was rather hurt, and then he went off to work. About 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and when the woman answered, she was handed a box of a dozen long-stemmed roses, red roses. And then at 1 p.m., a foil-wrapped 2-pound box of her favorite chocolates was delivered to the house. And then about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a boutique delivered a designer dress in exactly her size, and she was over the moon. She couldn't wait for her husband to get home, and finally he got home and she said to him, "Wow, what a day. First the flowers, then the chocolates, then the dress. This is the best Groundhog Day I have ever had." Today I'm actually talking about a different kind of day. I'm talking about the recognition of Black History Month and the amazing contributions of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whom we are all familiar with. But at the same time, you know, there are things about him that are very much related to what we teach in the science of mind, things that he said and did. Interestingly, the mystics of all the world faiths talk about our unity, our oneness. They talk about love as the undergirding of everything that is. The fact that no matter what kind of mistakes we make, we don't have to be afraid to go forward. And we don't have to be afraid to make mistakes. That our equality is perfect in the divine presence because it is absolutely and completely, totally accepting of every single one, exactly as they are and exactly as they are not. Which, if you look at the idea of God as omnipresent, or as we would say in the science of mind, as all there is, you know, for God to like one part of itself better than another would be a little bit peculiar. God is not like us. God doesn't look in the mirror and say, "I hate my nose." You know, it doesn't happen. So we are all held in that same equal depth of love as we discover who we are. Dr. Holmes and Dr. King were each born in January of their particular year, and they each made their transition in April of their particular death year, which I find very interesting. Although Holmes was born in January 21st, 1887, and died in 1960, Dr. King was born January 15th, 1929, and died in 1968. So when we look at these two guys together, what Holmes talked about was the presence of love and the availability of divine power and creativity through us to begin to shape our lives. He talked about unity then without uniformity. He talked about freedom, the freedom and liberty that we have to create the life that we want to be experiencing or something more like it, and how to do that. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the importance of brotherhood and community and love and justice and equality. So Holmes said, "We are one even while we are many. And since each of us is a part of the whole, if we seek to destroy each other, we only ultimately hurt ourselves. This is the great lesson of life." And Martin Luther King said, "As long as there is poverty in this world, no man can be totally rich even if he has $1 billion. We are connected to each other." Ernest Holmes said in Ideas for Living, and Ernest Holmes is the founder of our organization. He said in Ideas for Living, "I do not care very much for the word tolerance, as though we tolerated each other. That is better than intolerance, but people who are tolerant because they've made up their minds to be tolerant are missing a lot. I like the word understanding. Everything that is understood will be forgiven. There's no question about that. I'm not talking about forgiveness between God and man. God does not have to forgive, for God is eternal forgiveness. But everything that we really understand between each other will be forgiven. I do not know when such understanding will come to the world, so that nations will be able to lay down their arms. It will come, not today or tomorrow perhaps, as we measure time, but nothing can finally combat it. That process is infinite, painstaking, slow, but certain. Everything that is in line with unity is in the process of winning. Someday, we will come to perfectly appreciate the fact that no living soul is more important than any other one. For in the eternal kingdom of reality, they are all the same, king and slave, what we call rich and poor, what we call intelligent and unintelligent people, what we call worthwhile and not worthwhile people." And in his letter from the Birmingham City Jail, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And also, we must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right." So these two men, who did not meet each other as far as I know, were teaching us from their own traditions and perspectives similar kinds of things, important things. They were teaching us earth-changing, soul-changing things that we are still called to. You know, when you have a vision, the idea of a vision is that it's never completed. It's always in front of you as a goal, as a dream that you're moving toward incrementally. And so by the time you accomplish whatever that is, your vision, your dream, has extended outward from there. Because the universe is constantly creating and constantly expanding itself. I don't just mean physically. I mean in the creative process flowing through us. We are not here to be satisfied, but we are here to be fulfilled. And being fulfilled comes from engaging in what matters to us, personally, what we claim. And we as a community have claimed community and spiritual growth and love and integrity as our core values together, that we share those as the highest and most important values that we hold as a community. Martin Luther King said, "I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." In his final book, his fourth book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? It was published in 1967, in June. He was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee on Thursday, April 4th, 1968, less than a year later. He was 39 years old. 39 years old. In August of 1963, there was a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. It's estimated that 250,000 people came to that event. It was aimed at drawing attention to inequalities and inequities and challenges that were being faced by African Americans a century after the Emancipation Proclamation. And they took place at the Lincoln Memorial. This event took place at the Lincoln Memorial in August of 1963. So in April of 1963, Martin Luther King, I'm going to go back here. At least I think I am. Yeah. In 1963, this is where Martin Luther King was, in the Birmingham jail. He was in the Birmingham jail because he had gone there to Birmingham at the call of the people there as part of an organization that had offices all over the South. And he wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail to other pastors throughout the country who felt that he was an outsider interfering in what was happening in Birmingham, and he wanted to make clear to them why he was there and why it was important. Now, one of our members, Reverend Stan Stefancic, was a Unitarian minister in Birmingham while this was happening, and Stan, come on up, Stan. Stan met Dr. King, and I want him to be able to share a little bit about this with you. I think so.
Good morning. In September of 1965, I was beginning work on a PhD in philosophy of religion at Perkins School of Theology, which is affiliated with Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. In October, an organizer of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, came to Perkins to recruit students, theological students, to go to Huntsville, Texas, to demonstrate. What had happened is that a group of high school students, black high school students in Huntsville, formed an SCLC chapter, and they made sweatshirts with a white and a black hand clasped. They wore them to school. They were expelled. The next day, they were picked up for truancy and sent to state reformatories. So here were almost a dozen students in jail, in effect, for wearing a sweatshirt with a white and black hand on it. So the organizer came and asked us to participate in demonstrations in Huntsville, Texas. Huntsville was kind of a typical southern town with a big square, 1 block by 1 block, with a Confederate monument in the middle, which I always considered they were traitors to America, not heroes. And we picketed on weekends around that square. The first Friday we were there, the city sent maintenance people, who were mostly black, to rip up all of the benches all around the square so that we couldn't sit. And we were warned by the police if we loitered in the square, if we sat, we would be arrested for loitering. So we had to keep marching all day long. Finally, as a result of those marches, the kids were released from jail and were admitted back in school. A few months later, Dr. King was scheduled to give a major address at Southern Methodist University. And he insisted that he meet with all of the students who had demonstrated in Huntsville. And so some of the students, the high school students from Huntsville, came to Dallas, and before his lecture, about 2 or 3 hours before the lecture, we met with Dr. King. He told us about the goals of SCLC and talked to us and thanked us for our participation in Huntsville and liberating those high school students. Then he went around to each one of us and looked us straight in the eye and asked us about ourselves, asked me what I was studying and how it was going and so on, and thanked me for my participation. And I said, thank you for being an inspiration and showing us what it means to be a minister. Because one of the things we did in Huntsville, we went and visited all of the white ministers in the community to get them involved in the demonstration in this injustice, and guess how many participated?
Wow.
0. So now fast forward to 1970. In 1970, I became the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. I was in pretty good shape then. I played handball, lifted weights, and ran and so on. And so I joined the Businessmen's Club of the downtown Y. And one of the members there was Raymond Belcher, a chief deputy sheriff. One old big, I mean, he was a typical, stereotypical Southern sheriff with a big belly and swagger around. So one day he's bench pressing, and after he finishes, he says, "Yankee, what do you think of that?" I said, "Well, Raymond, you're really strong." So I went up and picked up 5-pound weights and put 5 pounds on each end of the barbell, and I went and I did my 10 bench presses. And afterwards, I went up to him and I said, "You know, Raymond, Yankee liberals are strong too." So as a result of that, we kind of became not friends, but tolerated one another. A couple weeks later, he said, "I suppose you want to come up to the jail and see where we had Martin Luther King." I said, "Absolutely, I would." So he invited me to lunch. I went to lunch. We had steaks at the jail. I don't think the inmates had steaks. And then he took me up to the floor to show me this jail cell, which was very important because the letter that came there was one of the major documents of the civil rights movement. It's an incredible letter. The letter from the Birmingham jail, which was actually written to the clergy in Birmingham who told him he was moving too fast and they should be gradual and blah, blah, blah. So Raymond took me up to the jail and he said, "I suppose you want to be here alone." I said, I would. And so he went away and I spent about 15 minutes there thinking about Dr. King, who was already dead. He'd been murdered in 68. And I had my moment at that jail, and it was an incredible experience, and as a result, I discovered the softer side of Raymond.
Wow.
So,
Dr. King, thank you. Thank you, Reverend Stan. I think Dr. King was still working. Ernest Holmes said, "God never hates, nor does God hold feelings of bitterness toward any person. Thus, the grudge holder is trying to express God and something else, which is impossible. God is not cut up into little sections. No one can say, 'I will accept God's healing, but not express God's love.' Since spirit is indivisible, the person who refrains from expressing God's love will be unable to accept God's health. Therefore, we should express love, for love is the fulfilling of the law." So this is the crowd from the Lincoln Memorial looking outward. 250,000 people. This is 5 years after he was in the Birmingham jail. That jail cell, which Stan told me earlier, and I didn't know this, that little tiny jail cell, they had 10 people in there. So this man, on the day that the March on Washington happened, he had been preparing this speech with some of his advisors. And at a certain point during the speech, Mahalia Jackson, who had been the soloist, yelled out to him, "Tell them about the dream," because this was a section of a talk he had given in other places, but that was not in the talk he intended to give on this day. And this is what happened.
"I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
Now, Dr. Martin Luther King was a Southern Baptist, an African American. His oratory and his accent and his way of speaking were very reflective and appropriate for that. The next thing I'm going to show for you, you're going to hear the voice of Ernest Holmes. Now, Ernest Holmes, who was born in 1887, was born in Maine, and he was a Yankee, a real Yankee, and you can hear it in his voice and his style of speaking. He's not doing his elocution here, but his style of speaking is reflective of that time and place, even though this little film is more contemporary.
Yes, you and I are individuals, but we are individuals rooted in one life, each drawing directly from it the power, the imagination, and the will to live as a personality of God, and to do this in a unique and a different manner. But of course, unity does not mean uniformity. We can live together in harmony and with cooperation without infringing on the rights of others. This is the real meaning of democracy and of personal freedom.
This is the real meaning of democracy and of personal freedom. So what do we know? What did we learn from all this? You know, Mother Teresa said once, we can do no great things. We can only do small things with great love. And Martin Luther King said, everyone can be great because everyone can serve. And so it doesn't matter what our skill set is, or how smart we are, or how old we are, how much money we have, how much educational background. Doesn't matter what political party we believe in, or what religion we are, what gender, what sexual orientation, whatever. It doesn't, none of that is important. What's important is that we are a community of human beings. And so when the opportunity for kindness is in front of us, that's what we're called to. We don't have to change the world. We just have to inhabit the moment that we're in. I want to share a story with you that I think is so sweet and touching. This is not about the civil rights movement, and it's not about these folks. This is about Franz Kafka. When he was 40 years old, the renowned Bohemian novelist and short story writer Franz Kafka, who had never married and had no children, was strolling through Steglitz Park in Berlin when he chanced upon a young girl crying her eyes out because she'd lost her favorite doll. And she and Kafka looked for the doll without success. So Kafka told her to meet him there the next day and they'd look again. And the next day, when they still had not found the doll, Kafka gave the little girl a letter written by the doll that said, "Please do not cry. I have gone on a trip to see the world. I'm going to write to you about my adventures." And thus began a story that continued to the end of Kafka's life. When they would meet, Kafka read aloud his carefully composed letters of adventures and conversations about the beloved doll, which the girl found enchanting. Finally, Kafka read her a letter of the story that brought the doll back to Berlin, and then he gave her a doll he had purchased. "This doesn't look like my doll at all," she said, and Kafka handed her another letter that explained, "My trips, they have changed me." The girl hugged the new doll and took it home with her. A year later, Kafka died. Many years later, the now grown-up girl found a letter tucked into an unnoticed crevice in the doll. The tiny letter, signed by Kafka, said, "Everything you love is very likely to be lost, but in the end, love will return in a different way." And so this message to us, I think the gift and the legacy that's left to us and the lessons are that we have a responsibility. And our responsibility is to choose to act with love and to kindle the vision and the dream, to not let it go no matter what the conditions and circumstances look like, to be engaged in justice, in freedom, in respect, and in love. And yesterday, as I was on the minister's listserv, I saw a notice from Reverend Kathy Ann Lewis, who said that this song that I'm about to play for you was perfect to share during this Black History Month. Now, the message is very clear, although some of the images are not positive, and they may not match your point of view, but I encourage you to look beyond the individual images to the message. So this is the message this morning. Our love can change the world. It doesn't have to change everything all at once. We're not responsible to change the world alone. It's each of us, all of us, one by one. That was the dream and the message back then, and the dream is still alive. Namaste.